It was a crisp Friday morning in November when I found myself in the supermarket with my grandmother. The Thanksgiving holiday was just around the corner, and like everyone else, we were running around doing our final shopping. The aisles were crowded, carts filled with ingredients for holiday dinners. It felt like an ordinary day, a mundane trip to stock up on the things we needed for a family gathering. But I had no idea that one small moment would set everything in motion. We were near the produce section, carefully picking out vegetables when it happened. A man, somewhere in his 40s, came charging down the aisle. His shopping cart banged into my grandmother's with such force that she almost lost her balance. I instinctively stepped forward to help her steady herself, but the man didn't even look at us. He didn't apologize, didn't even seem to notice. Instead, he made a noise, a disgruntled harumph, followed by the words, "Some people really are rude." His tone was condescending, dismissive. He wasn't even looking at us as he spoke. It was as if he felt completely justified in his entitled behavior. And at that moment, I snapped. Now, I'm sure some of you are thinking, why not just let it go? It was an accident. And in another world, I might have. But here's the thing, it wasn't an accident. He was rude, and he wasn't even remotely aware of how his behavior was affecting others. My grandmother was shaken, and he didn't even seem to care. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. He didn't just bump into her, he brushed us off as if we were nothing, not even worthy of a simple apology. I looked at him for a second, and I could feel the tension building in me. How many times had I let people like this get away with their behavior? How many times had I stayed silent when I should have spoken up? This was different. This was personal. It didn't take long for me to realize I wasn't just angry at him for bumping into my grandmother. I was angry at him for his sense of entitlement. This man thought he could walk through life without considering the people around him. And that's when it hit me. I had to do something. I couldn't just let him get away with this. I didn't know exactly how yet, but I would make sure he paid for what he did. So I started paying attention. It wasn't hard. Every time I went to the supermarket, I saw him. He was a creature of habit, showing up at the same time each day, standing in the same spot in the checkout line, cutting ahead of others, making others uncomfortable. I watched his every move, learning his routine, and every time I saw him, my resolve to do something about it grew stronger. I didn't want to do something petty. No, I wanted something that would really get under his skin, something that would make him realize that no one is above the rules. And then it clicked. The coffee shop. He had mentioned it once, casually bragging about how he went there every morning, got his coffee, and left. That was the place where I'd make my move. It wasn't about embarrassing him in front of a crowd, though. I knew that. It was about subtly reminding him of his place, making him see that his actions had consequences, even when he didn't expect them. And so, I made my plan. The next time I saw him, I was ready. I went into the coffee shop the following morning, well before he typically arrived. I picked a spot where I could see him walk in. He always ordered the same thing, a medium black coffee. Simple, predictable, and that was my opening. I stood at the counter, acting casual but with purpose. I asked the barista questions, the most annoying ones, the ones that would take time. How many types of milk do you offer? Is almond milk better than oat milk? Can you explain the difference between a cappuccino and a latte? Each question, drawn out with purposeful slowness. He walked in, his usual confident stride, eyes scanning the shop for an opening. But when he saw me at the counter, blocking his way, he hesitated. I smiled to myself. He wasn't expecting this. He wasn't expecting to have to wait. When I was finished asking my questions, I pretended to have a change of heart. "Actually, let me go ahead and get back in line and think about it," I said to the barista. I stepped aside and he hesitated, his face reddening with frustration. He was stuck, unable to cut in line like he usually did. It was working. For the first time, he had to stand there and wait his turn, just like everyone else. But this wasn't just about cutting the line. This was about reminding him that he wasn't above anyone else, that the world didn't revolve around him. As I watched him fumble with his order, trying to hide his discomfort, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but I could see it in his eyes. After my subtle maneuver in the coffee shop, I could feel the anticipation building. Every time I saw the man walk into that coffee shop, I felt a rush of satisfaction, knowing that soon he would face a bigger consequence. My plan wasn't just about getting even. It was about sending a clear message. No one is above the rules. I started arriving at the coffee shop a little earlier each day, just so I could get there before him. I would pick a spot at the counter and wait. Every time I saw him walk in, I could sense his confidence, his usual swagger. But with each passing day, I could see it start to crumble. He was no longer cutting the line as smoothly as he once had. It was time to take this to the next level. One morning, he walked in, just as usual, scanning the shop for an opening. But this time, I was ready. I had an even bigger plan in mind. I wasn't just going to block him from cutting in line again. This time, I was going to drag out the process. I stood up from my seat and approached the counter. He saw me immediately, and I could see his posture stiffen. But he didn't say anything, not yet. I took my place at the counter, and just as the barista was about to take my order, I deliberately started asking questions. "Can you tell me about the differences between your pastries? Which one has the most chocolate?" The barista looked at me, slightly confused, but I could see the look in his eyes. He was trying not to laugh. I could feel the man's frustration behind me, but I didn't care. This wasn't just about waiting his turn anymore. This was about making him feel the discomfort of being on the other side for once. "Do you have oat milk? What's the difference between that and almond milk? Does one froth better?" I asked, drawing each question out. He shifted impatiently behind me, clearly trying to figure out how to navigate the situation without making a scene. His usual tactic, to pretend to be too important for the rules, wasn't going to work here. He had to wait just like everyone else. And then, when I saw the slight tremor in his hands as he reached for his wallet, I knew I had succeeded. He was uncomfortable, and that was exactly what I wanted. After several minutes, I finished my questions. I smiled to myself as I stepped aside to pay. I hadn't just held him up, I had made him feel what it was like to be treated like everyone else. But I could see him. I could see the change in his demeanor. As I walked out of the coffee shop, I looked back and saw him standing there, hands on his hips, looking like a man who had just had his world turned upside down. He wasn't the confident man I had seen walking in. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes scanning the room as if he were trying to figure out where he went wrong. The next few days were a blur, but something changed in him. He stopped acting like he owned the place. He started waiting in line, just like everyone else. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, but as time passed, I realized that he had learned his lesson. And that was when I knew my plan was working. One afternoon, about a week after the coffee shop encounter, I saw him again. He had always come in at the same time, but this time he looked different. His swagger was gone. The confidence I had grown to hate had been replaced by something else. He was more subdued, and I could tell he was thinking carefully about his actions. I watched as he stood in line, waiting for his turn, just like everyone else. But something about the way he stood there told me that he was no longer the same man who had barged in front of my grandmother at the supermarket. His arrogance had been replaced by humility, and I couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction. My plan was working. It wasn't just the coffee shop anymore. Over the following weeks, I saw him interact with others differently. His business meetings, the ones I had overheard him bragging about, weren't going well. I began to hear rumors around the office. People were talking. The deals he had once secured with ease were now falling apart. At first, I thought it was coincidence. But the more I heard, the more I realized that the consequences of his behavior were beginning to catch up with him. His entitled attitude, his disregard for others, had finally made him vulnerable. People weren't going to put up with it anymore. He wasn't just being called out by me. The world was starting to see him for who he truly was. I hadn't planned on it, but the payoff came one afternoon when I was sitting at the coffee shop, enjoying my usual drink. He walked in again, but this time he wasn't walking with his usual confidence. Instead, he was looking around nervously, as if he were trying to avoid someone. I watched as he sat down in the corner, looking out of place. His whole demeanor screamed defeat. This wasn't the same man who had cut in line and brushed everyone off. This was a man who was feeling the weight of his actions. And as I looked at him, I realized something important. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It wasn't about making him feel humiliated. It was about watching him change, watching him confront the consequences of his entitled behavior. That was the real victory. A few weeks had passed since I'd first put my plan into motion. The man, let's call him George for simplicity, had been acting different. I noticed the change in his attitude, his behavior. He wasn't the same confident, entitled man who had once strutted into the coffee shop, expecting to get whatever he wanted without consequence. No, now George seemed more reserved, almost subdued. He no longer barged to the front of the line. He didn't brush people off with his usual arrogance. Instead, he waited. He thought carefully before speaking. But that wasn't all. Over the next few weeks, I began to hear whispers of George's business deals falling apart. It started with a colleague of mine who worked in the same industry. One day, as I sipped my coffee at work, she mentioned casually, "I heard George's latest project fell through. Apparently, his investors pulled out because of his behavior issues." That piqued my interest. George was known for his business ventures. He had a reputation for being a go-getter, a self-starter. But now he was struggling. It was karma in action, and I couldn't help but smile inwardly. My plan had worked. But then, something unexpected happened. As the weeks went by, I noticed that George wasn't just facing professional setbacks. I started seeing him everywhere. And it wasn't the usual George I had encountered. No, he was different now. His once confident demeanor had been replaced with a quiet, almost nervous energy. I saw him at the coffee shop one morning, and it was impossible to ignore the fact that he was alone. Gone was the usual entourage he used to flaunt. Gone were the flashy displays of wealth and superiority. He was just another guy, waiting for his order in line. And it was clear he had lost something, his edge. It was at that moment I realized something important. George wasn't just facing external consequences. No, the real issue was that his sense of self was crumbling. He wasn't the man he used to be. And while I had gotten my revenge, he had paid the price. I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of sadness. Over the next few days, I began to feel an unexpected doubt creeping in. George was no longer the confident, entitled man I had once seen. He was broken. And for the first time, I found myself wondering if this was enough. Was this justice, or had I gone too far? I thought back to the moment when I decided to take action. My grandmother had been pushed, treated as though she didn't matter, and I had reacted. But now, as I saw George walking around with his head down, looking unsure of himself, I began to wonder if I had overstepped. Did he deserve to lose everything? I couldn't shake the feeling that while he had learned a valuable lesson, maybe the price was too high. And it was hard not to feel some remorse for the man who had lost so much. Yes, he had been rude, and yes, he had been entitled. But had my actions been too harsh? Was there a point where revenge crosses into something more destructive? A week later, I was at home, relaxing after a long day. It was the first time in a while that I felt comfortable. The guilt, the uncertainty, they were still there, but I had been pushing it aside. But then the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find George standing there, looking nervous, his hands in his pockets. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I didn't know what to expect. "Hey," he said, his voice quieter than I had ever heard. "Can we talk?" We sat down in my living room, and George started to speak. He was no longer the arrogant man I had once known. He was humble, almost apologetic. And for the first time, I saw him as a real person, not just the antagonist I had built him up to be. "I owe you an apology," he began, looking down. "I've been a jerk. I know that. I've treated people like they're beneath me, and I thought I could get away with it forever, but I couldn't. I guess you were right." He paused for a moment. "I'm not proud of who I've become, and I'm trying to change." He looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw vulnerability in his eyes. "I just wanted to say that I've learned something from all this. I'm not perfect, but I'm trying to be better." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to feel vindicated, to relish the moment. But instead, I found myself feeling something else, a sense of compassion. I sat in silence for a moment, processing his words. Could I forgive him? After everything that had happened, after everything I had done to make sure he faced the consequences of his actions, could I actually forgive him? Part of me wanted to say, "I'm glad you've learned your lesson," and move on. But another part of me felt a twinge of empathy. I had never wanted to destroy him. I had just wanted to teach him a lesson. The question was, had he learned it? Was this man truly changing, or was this just another form of manipulation? I didn't know, but I knew one thing for sure. He wasn't the same man who had treated my grandmother and me with such disrespect. And that, in itself, was a form of justice. After George left, I spent the next few days reflecting. I had wanted to make him feel the way I had felt, the way my grandmother had felt. I wanted him to be humbled, and now I realized that he had been. The revenge the lesson had been learned. But I also realized that I didn't need to hold on to it anymore. Revenge wasn't about keeping someone down. It was about making them reflect and change. And that's exactly what had happened. It wasn't about the public exposure or the humiliation or even his losses. It was about seeing him face the consequences of his actions and realizing that he could change. And that, in the end, was the greatest lesson of all. Days passed after George's visit, and as I reflected on everything, I started feeling a sense of peace. What I thought would bring me satisfaction, revenge, didn't feel as good as I had imagined. Instead, I felt empty in a way I hadn't expected. I had wanted him to suffer, to learn a lesson, but now that I saw how much it had changed him, I began to question if it had been the right path. The man I had sought revenge on was no longer the same. His swagger was gone, replaced with a quieter, humbler demeanor. He had learned, but was that enough? I had thought that seeing him humbled would give me closure, but instead, I was left with more questions. Was revenge really worth it? Or was it simply a temporary satisfaction that ultimately didn't matter? One afternoon, while sitting at home with a cup of tea, I realized something. I needed to let go. Holding on to this need for revenge was not healthy. The man had changed, and it was time for me to move forward as well. I couldn't keep carrying the weight of his wrongs. My goal had been to show him that his actions had consequences, and I had done that. But now, the real lesson wasn't just for George, it was for me too. Revenge wasn't the answer. Healing was. A few days later, I saw George at the coffee shop again. This time, there was no arrogance, no cutting in line, no flash of entitlement. He stood quietly in line like everyone else. When I walked past him, our eyes met for just a second, but there was something different this time. It wasn't the same anger or need for retaliation in me. Instead, there was a quiet acknowledgement. He had changed, and so had I. In that moment, I realized the revenge wasn't the true victory. The real victory was in seeing him confront the consequences of his actions and accepting them. And in turn, I had learned that letting go brought a sense of peace I hadn't expected. I had wanted to hurt him, to see him pay for his rudeness and entitlement. But now, I realized that change, for both of us, was what mattered most. Revenge didn't need to be about punishment. It was about growth, learning, and moving on. George had been humbled, but more importantly, I had grown. I didn't need to punish him further. I needed to let go of the anger and embrace the peace that came with knowing that justice had been served in a quiet, unspoken way. What do you think about this story? Did I go too far with my revenge, or was it justified? Have you ever had a moment when you acted out of anger and later realized it wasn't what you truly wanted? Let me know your thoughts and your own revenge stories in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, smash that like button, subscribe for more, and remember to always stay true to yourself. Sometimes, the most powerful revenge is simply to let go and move forward. Until next time, keep growing, keep learning, and always strive for peace.